In this first episode on Bismarck, it will be prudent for us to examine the power of one man's vision. This is probably the ultimate advantage, the historical transcendent success that Bismarck had, because he was able to unite a goal and a strategy from its inception to a causal reality. Now, manifesting something like this is very, very difficult, and the reason he gets so much credence when it comes to discussing historical figures is because his ability to persuade and also politic in a way that was almost unforeseen. There obviously were very many emperors and heads of state who participated in politics in that way, in grand politics across the centuries in Europe. But Bismarck represented what was something of a aberration, in that he was a democratically elected official who was appointed to a charge before the Chancellor of Germany in foreign affairs in Prussia, such that he was able to influence Prussian state affairs politically in a way that enabled them to expand and grow and subsume Greater Germany and instituting the Second Reich. So it's very interesting to us that one man who didn't necessarily command an army was able to do this, whereas historically, if you look at other leaders like Napoleon, for instance, where it was the crux of his power was residing in the armed forces and the mass of infantry he was able to procure. So for us, this is what makes Bismarck more interesting in our day and age, because politics becomes an affair in and of itself. Klaus von Clausewitz obviously saying that it was a war is an extension of politics, but politics is the preeminent version of existence in our non-treasure state, which is the way of saying, if you're not a capitalist, you're not a businessman, what do you do in terms of life fulfillment? Well, you're a politician because you care about power. And the way we see about power is usually related, as Schmidt says, to the land, to the nomos, because of the way that we take our view of a reality is that, do you own land? And the land that you can command represents all of the downstream effects: capital, people, resources, strategic things like forts and fortifications. And so you can understand why land is the most important part of politics and power, and that the people are, I say, symbiotic to the land. So you own the people and the land are the same. This was a very far-ranging idea from serfdom in Russia all the way through to the feudalism and the subsequent land leasing from peasants or farmers in the UK. But it was generally the approved principle that if you owned the land, you were given a substantial amount of power, because there's a corresponding effect to that. Money has less to do with it than necessarily you'll be rich or poor. Is less of an effect of owning land that allows you to be a commander in the army. And this is definitely why you have different formations around land ownership and knightly classes. And so the Junkers in Germany, or Prussia at that time, were the politicians. They were the important people making the decisions around these things, because they were seen as tied to the land in a way that allowed them to understand the needs, but also separate themselves from the peasant class, who were just there to toil the earth and be presented as soldiers during their 18th to 25th year of age for men. And so for us, I think it's very important for us to understand the position that he was born into as a Junker in his age, making sure that you can empathize, or at least vicariously understand how he was brought up and what he believed in. Now, he was a Prussianist to the heart, to the core. So his reactionary principles resided much to that end. How is Prussia the strongest? And this was his goal in life. So his assumption and presumption into politics rested on the fact that he was a nationalist, a Prussian nationalist, in a way that saw his only aspiration to be growing and strengthening Prussia. Now, we understand Germany in manifold ways. Firstly, as the Eastern Holy Roman Empire, or the Frankish Empire after the death of Charlemagne. It becomes its own national body, but its disintegration and reformation into the Holy Roman Empire, which we saw for 800 years, and then on its dissolution in the Napoleonic Wars, into something much more German at its base. It's that we all speak this language due to various colonialization of the areas by German tribes of the preceding 1500 years. So how exactly can we tie that all together into a nationalistic principles? Because the unification of an ethnicity requires coordination, it requires conciliation around grudges and previous visions of I want this, you want this, these are irreconcilable. This is where blood and iron comes into it for Bismarck, because his understanding of the 1848 revolutions in the Frankfurt Parliament is that it wasn't sufficient to unite Germany on liberal principles. You can't just have a very appealing document and say now everyone should sign up for this, because you will have people who are losing power and they will not want to lose the power willingly. You have to make them lose the power. Once again, power here correspondent directly to land. Land is very easily understood as having power, both as a sole ownership and then also as the ability to raise forces and armed forces. So you can understand why that there's a certain level of friction in any scenario which requires the sequestration of land in that way. You're going to have one party who is going to be losing out, and in doing so, their umbrage requires that they want recompense, and if they can't have recompense, then they'll violently assault you or an uprise. So you have to have war in some shape or form to be able to reconcile these differences. Bismarck understood this. He witnessed what was when he was a young man. He was born in 1815, and so he witnessed these things as a younger man at 33 years old, just starting into politics and not having very much power, and then witnessing what was the strife and the counter-revolutions and things like that going on throughout Germany, or Greater Germany, the German-speaking states as they were, including Austria, which at the time was the grander state compared to Prussia. So you can understand from his perspective that if his goal and his vision is a united Prussian Empire, or the greatest, strongest Prussia, then if that corresponds to a German Reich, how do we get there? And so in the 60s, we have this formation of, you could say, the salience of this. So the solidification of the idea of a greater Reich, or a German-speaking Reich for Bismarck. And he goes on to say this in some letters to Benjamin Disraeli, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the point. So I'll just read you two quotes here from Bismarck. One I found fairly, you could say, ominous, or shades of the general thought at that time. So he goes on to say, and this is about the Poles, hit the Poles so hard that they despair of their life. I have full sympathy with their condition, but if we want to survive, we can only exterminate them. The wolf, too, cannot help having been created by God as he is, but people should shoot him if they can. And if that doesn't give you contextualization on why or how the idea of both force and power occurred to Bismarck as its extent, is that if you have Prussia and there are Poles living in Prussia, these are not Prussians, these are Poles. And there needs to be something done about this. And this is how he conceptualized the power dynamic of this. It's also the residual effect of the clash of clans. So Prussians being Germans and then Poles being Slavs, that they'll never be able to understand one another on that very intrinsic basal level. And thus you have the blood condition. And the iron because of the gun, obviously. And so we have the pre-formulation of his methodology here. The second quote is to Disraeli. The first one was to his sister, Malvina. I shall soon be compelled to undertake the conduct of the Prussian government. My first care shall be to reorganize the army, with or without the help of the Landtag. As soon as the army shall have been brought into such a condition as to inspire respect, I shall seize the first best pretext to declare war against Austria, dissolve the German Diet, subdue the minor states, and give national unity to Germany under Prussian leadership. I come here to say this to the Queen's ministers. This being in 1862, which gives us the age of Bismarck, being about 47. So in his Middle Ages at this point. He's very clearly understood that the cynosure of his life, of his goals now, as he represents Prussia as a politician, as a leader, is that there's a unification purpose to this. What am I doing? The next 30, 40 years has to be dedicated to one single thing. This is the power here around the idea of a goal. If you drift through your own life without for him it was a very supra-personal and transcendental goal, but if you have this idea of something grander than you, that's my goal, and I will die trying to achieve it, and then after achieving it, grow it, strengthen it, and defend it. So you can understand why it becomes very powerful for a man to live above himself in that way. I have an understanding of Prussia first before me, first before my king, first before anybody. The idea of Prussia then needs to reside in all my decision making, and everything I do in my life is in aid of this goal obtainment. That's it. It's the most apposite in terms of purpose, methodologies, interactions. Everything has to have this background of I need to unite Prussia or Germany under Prussian rule. The end. Nothing else needs to come in between these things. You can't have, you say for him probably quite an expansive personal life, but you can't have distractions on this goal. You can't, like most statesmen at the time, and then also lords and kings, is to say you get distracted with different affairs, and there's never a vision. And you can see this very typically with modern politicians. There's no vision. Almost none of them have this idea of where do we want our society to go. It's business as usual. How can I maintain status quo? How do I keep all these parties semi-happy and satisfied? But this leaves a very sour taste because we're never actually going anywhere. And if anything, there's a decline, a very distinct and measurable decline in all these areas because you're trying to assuage all these parties with things, and Schmidt calls this the weakness of total state, is that you'll eventually crumble because your inability to satisfy all these disparate and irreconcilable parties comes out in your policy. You have nothing to offer anybody that they want. It's like, oh, I have a little bit of peace and crumb here, but no one's ever satiated on that amount of food, political food. Whereas if you have the goal, and I say like, you elect me because I'm going to do this as my vision. I'm going to make America the grandest empire in the world. We're going to colonize the moon, and we're going to expand throughout the galaxy. That is the Liberator 2028 ploy to become prime minister, president, whatever it is, your political office. You say that's the goal, the end. This is stated as a statement of fact. When I go into my speeches, this is the resounding principle. Everything is redolent of this idea, and you might think of it as something like a recrudescence on it, but it's the positive version of this, where everything has to be reformed into how does this strengthen, how does this help us, how does this go towards obtaining my goal. This goal orientation is monomaniacal. It isn't enough if you want to be great in life to have disparate aims and whims and go about doing things in a disorganized and not necessarily coherent manner or congruent to a certain place priority. If you've started life, say, I want to be rich, that's actually quite a good goal because it allows you to back solve. You can piece in what needs to be done in between. Now, you won't get the priorities and the singular instances correct in this incremental phase. You will say, like, sometimes you'll plan to do this and it ends up being this. But as long as these are all coordinated into achieving the goal, you will find yourself getting there. And then you determine what is rich to me. If you're from a very middle class background, maybe rich is $5 million, maybe it's $10 million. But if you've started life and you understand that people around you earn much more money than that by being lucky, opportunistic, working hard, then you can start to formulate in your brain rich being $100 million. And you say, that's a laughable amount of money. That is not so crazy. Let me tell you, that is not a crazy amount of money. There are a lot of people who start with zero at 18, particularly men, go on to create something, have a vision, build towards it, and then make sure they obtain that. There will be failures, of course, and there will be a lot of people who don't achieve those things, even though that's their stated goal and ambition. But let me tell you that the person who's defined that as their goal will get closer than anyone else who's vaguely interested in being rich and having that much. If you say, I would rather die than not reach my goal of $100 million, you have odds on better that you'll achieve that than almost anyone else in the world. Now, sometimes it's easy to say I build things and I enjoy them and I enjoy the solving problem aspect to this, and I'll reward myself, or I am rewarded by the market for that. Someone like Jeff Bezos building Amazon, for instance, there's a huge hole in this market. I want to do the thing that solves that problem. Whether I'm rich or not is secondary almost to this problem-solving ambit I have. But in general, he was successful because he was leaving a hedge fund, D. Shaw, where he was on pathway to probably being $50, $100 million net worth anyway. So his ability to leave that position and trust and back himself in something in a venture speaks much more volume towards having a goal orientation to that. And once again, great men do these things because they orientate them more towards a goal monomaniacally. It is the only thing that they care about, to the detriment of almost everything else in their lives. And you say, okay, well, I don't want to do that, I want to sacrifice. That's fine, but that won't be great, and that's not how greatness is achieved. This is why Bismarck has taught us these things in politics, almost to the preeminence of anyone else. I don't think there's another politician that comes close to Bismarck in this realm of being able to conjure together an idea and tessellate between the presuppositions and go all the way through to the obtainment of that, and building the Second Reich and being Chancellor of the Reich for 19 years. I don't think it's possible to compare him to almost any other leader because of the way that he was Machiavellian almost in his connivings and back dealings and making sure that his underhanded and overhanded activities, clandestine or otherwise, were done in a way that was, once again, concerted in an effort towards obtaining this one goal. This is how we start to think about Bismarck in his greatness, is that for all the trappings and all of the titles he may have had, and we consider him as a man and as a person, but also as a historical figure, you have to go, what is I can reduce this guy to? Because how is he that different from me? Was he taller? Was he smarter? Was he more handsome? And like maybe on a variable case, he 10%, 20% here or there. Is he much smarter than you? Probably not. Maybe if you're watching this video on this channel and you've taken an IQ test and you're 145, that's more than enough IQ. Are you as born into success and he was a Junker, so are you born into royalty? Probably not. I mean, the probability of that being true is very, very low. But I can guarantee you that even if he wasn't, he was still going to rise to some degree of greatness because of the way that he was able to take his characteristics and his mental state and once again forge it into this, in this crucible, into something that is wielded like a sword. How do I make sure that my will is felt by everyone around me? Once again, none of this requires, you could say, the nature of anything other than your genetics and being born into it, and then forging it. So you have these natural abilities and you start to train them and put yourself into form. He was in form as a politician for 40 years. He made sure that the decisions he was making were to best his opponents at every stage. And it could be the regional and parochial opponents. It could be his enemies in the broader German states, and then internationally if it was Russia or as the UK or France. And you can see this in the three main wars that he was participant in or was in control of in most ways, in that he was able to dominate Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein using Austrian allies. Once again, proving that might is right in the way that the command of power necessitates the utilization of power, and that you have to force victory and then understand what victory conditions are and look like. If you've liberated somewhere and then you abandon it, then it's obviously going to have a power vacuum and be filled. If I liberate Holstein and then I occupy it and it's now Germany, it's very hard to crawl that back, even after 100 years. You can see that after the obviously end of World War II, a lot of those partitions and irredentism was ripe, and in particular in American context, they and the USSR decided what was going to happen to all of these once territories of other kingdoms. But the next war against Austria, it was also around the same case. How do I build a circumstance in which we can declare war on Austria, a global power at that time, or at least a very, very strong regional power, defeat them and then establish our dominance over them without being able to draw the ire of the other great powers in the region like Russia and France and the British. So how do we do that? When you have to maintain a set of parameters around this that make sure the interference is on a valid and a legalistic or juristic position. It's to say we are able to declare war without the ire of the other states, because the nature in which it was formed, the war declared, it was able to be in a natural position. It's a casus belli. It's the just war in that case. We say, look, there's a conflict here. We need to resolve it, but we want to resolve it without inducing anyone else to start to take sides, because we've seen in Napoleon wars that could mean the massive loss of our own territory. Once again, Prussia had to be the dominant force here. He was also party to the institution of the Zollverein across the Greater Reich. Now, it was already instituted in something like 1815, but the idea that you have an economic union stabilizes all of these regions as a united force. It's like once we have socio, which is the German people's connection, then we can also do it economically, and that dissolves a lot of the boundaries and a lot of the barriers towards unification. And so he did the same thing with Austria, and then also to France, because there was a lot of the Low Countries, and particularly around here, where you had the states, the German states, being occupied by France, and German speakers basically being occupied by other states. So how do we unite these? Once again, it goes into that. I need to be able to defeat France in a war in 1871 and then command all those states, which he was able to do, once again, because of his policy measures internally and domestically, which were related to the blood and iron, making sure that you have enough troops with the same mentality around how do we wage war, the generals are on board, and that you have enough guns and equipment to be able to be a very effective fighting force. The institution of doctrines, the institution of multiplying effects of force, and the demonstrative effects of weaponry, and technology and weaponry especially. So this for Bismarck represents what is his strategy. How do I achieve the goal that I've set? And he was able to do it in that way because of, once again, his own willpower, but to the maintenance of a very specific, achievable goal. Now, achievable in this sense is very grand, but that's what you are in your position. If you're the middle manager of a paper company, then maybe your goal is to be CEO, and there has to be a way for you to pathway that. You can plan and you can design your own success around those conditions. You say, this is my goal. This is the only goal I'll have in life. Now, whether it's a great goal or a very mediocre goal or what have you, that's related to you personally. But it is to say that once you maintain this goal, then this is the stepwise fashion around achieving it. As you see, understanding that there's a calculation, a tabulation of these things. And so you have to appreciate the unknown and the known knowns and the unknown known knowns. And so that there will be this space of probability on these things, and it's not going to be the case that you're going to know everything about everything and then you'll be able to make all the best decisions. But it is the case that even in losses, you have to understand that there's a way to recoup and a way to recover and a way to hopefully come back to the battle. But if you win, you have to understand what winning looks like and how to maintain the momentum of winning. It isn't sufficient to be satisfied with a win and do nothing with it, establish nothing, and go forward in any meaningful sense. Celebrating wins is a bit like this, where you bust out the champagne shower and then completely lose sight of what the goal was before the win. You can see this in particular with combat sports, where the champion is very difficult to defend the title because the amount of willpower required to defend something rather than trying to win something is very different. And so with Bismarck, once again, this is how he was able to maintain it. It's like, I'm not stopping until Prussia is the dominant force in this German Reich. And that's where he got, and that's what the result was. So hopefully that teaches you something, at least around your own goals and your own obtainment. And hopefully one of you is the next American emperor.